I'm going to show you my UV tools and workflow. Hopefully you'll find it as quick and efficient as I do. We'll start by adding a palette and setting up a few tools. Quantize move, rotate, and scale. I may not use those directly for the UV, but I do like to have these tools to be in the palette as well. We'll then add texture view, set UV from projection, UV manager, UV unwrap, fit UV to canvas, and then mirror U and V. Now that we're done with that, I'll tuck it here and we can proceed. First I'll show what I would normally have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's a lot of flat graphics for the most part, but I want to show how quickly you can map something to a shape, any shape. First of all, I'll show a simple one. And I just wanted to make a shape that's recognizable. If you look at the UV space that's by default, all of these faces are kind of set on top of each other, which is typically not the best scenario for, like, if you're taking this object and you're kicking it out into another renderer. It doesn't really kind of like those scenarios, so we're going to set up a quick UV layout for this guy. What I found that is if you bring, normally you view models in these 4 windows, if you limit it to the window you're projecting straight through. So I'm going to project through this view and use frontal. Then you get this exact shape in your UV space. Then in order so that your texture takes up this entire space, no matter what kind of proportion your texture is, it's always crammed into this square. So in order to get the most amount of information without having to have a huge file, we do want to stretch this to take up this space. And you can easily do that by selecting your faces. So you can select the faces in this screen, or you can select them here, doesn't really matter, and fit UVs to canvas. Because I've stretched it to the 1-to-1 space, if I were to try to do UV mapping, like take this image and bring it into Photoshop, it's going to be really difficult to get these kind of proportions right so that they don't look distorted. And instead, what you want to do is just do a screenshot of this in your model window. I like to use the wand just to get my corners and then crop it. This gets you to a nice organized UV layout. And I'll open up, let's say, wood texture. Grab this guy, move him over. those. I just want to get something that'll cover it for this demonstration. And to make sure that everything is demonstrated correctly, I'll put this here, take this guy, kind of flip him. And we'll save as new UV. I like to save as TIFF just because, like in a Windows view, you can see the thumbnail that's generated once you created your graphic. If you save it out as a PSD, then you just get the icon. You don't get kind of you just get the icon of the Photoshop icon, but you don't get a thumbnail of the graphic. And with TIFFs, you can still have layered information just like you would on a Photoshop file. So why not just use something that has a thumbnail already? So I will find this graphic, bring it in. All right, so now you see that it's quickly mapped to the correct position. Even though it appears distorted here, our graphic is created on something that's in the right proportion. So that graphic essentially is stretched out left to right and now fits perfectly on your object. So on these edges, you can see that it's distorted because you're projecting straight through the object, and all of the data on the very edge is bleeding through the thickness. So I can show you how to, in other scenarios, get rid of that. I could show it on this one as well, but let's move on to something more interesting. Let's say you have a pill. Let's do a couple of different approaches. So like just how you saw there, this is the default UV layout. And if you have this, make it editable. We'll make these all editable. The white line here shows where these UV cut line is. And you want to start from scratch just because it's way easier. So we'll use what would normally be the default, which is flat. And when you do that, I didn't have the UV tag selected, so it created another tag. You don't want to do this. You just want to have one UV set. So this is the one we just created, and I got rid of the other one. A quick way to create the UVs for this object is to use the edge selection in the transform mode. Double click, and it creates the loop selection. And because these edges are selected, that's what this UV unwrap tool is going to use as the cut line for your UVs. So if we click that, these edges are on the perimeter of your cut. If you want to straighten up these like I do, I like to have things very organized. You can tell that this is not completely vertical. You select one edge, and you select Align UV Islands, and it'll find the most vertical or most horizontal position for your UV set. Once something's like that is done, if you wanted to make it, take up the most efficient amount of space, you can click on this UV mapping button, UV packing. I tend to like geometric or bounding box. I also make sure that preserve orientation is clicked and apply. So this will find the most space efficient. And if you don't want the edges going right up to it, you can increase the gap size, and it spaces everything off of each other a little bit more. And I've noticed that sometimes if you have it going right up to the edge, there's a little bit of distortion on your graphic once you've applied it. So let's take a look at what wood or fabric would look like on this. So if we applied wood, it's not too bad. At least you don't get distortions right on the edge, but maybe it could be better. Let's try fabric. That's not bad either. I mean, especially from the front, it would be fine. You don't really notice the seam on the side, but there are other ways to do it. There's more than one way to skin a pill. So let's do what we did before, making sure we select the UV tag, use the default so there's no cut lines, edge selection, make sure this is selected so you can get your loop selections, double click, and maybe in this case we will cut just this section so it's kind of a piece of paper wrapped around a cylinder, and then you've got the top and bottom caps. And there you go. It's easy as that. So if we apply a fabric to that, it's not too bad again, but you know, you do see this kind of line showing up. But still, not too bad, just another approach. Let's select this guy. Start from scratch again. How about cut there and there. And this will generate something like a banana unpeeled. There we go. Just another approach. And again, none of these have the distortion that you would have with a default map, which is what this looks like. So you have default, you have one approach, another one, and another one. All depending on what you want to do, how you want to decorate it, what's important to show or display graphic-wise, whether it's text or any other important details. Each of these approaches might work. The default might work, another approach, and so on and so forth. One additional thing that I'd like to show is that with all of these selected, you could UV pack them. What this does is, even though you've generated all these UVs independently, you can lay all the UVs out all at once and have one texture for multiple scenarios. And to demonstrate that these are all proportionate, you can see that the texture size is relatively the same. They're just oriented differently because the mapping is different. But because it is a repeating pattern, you can just increase the UV spread over the one-to-one UV workspace, and it just repeats. So anything outside of this square is just another repeat of the graphic. So you're almost kind of getting more resolution by adding more repeats to the texture. Let's see what happens if you use wood. Not too bad. Let's say you were in a real hurry and you wanted to just have it project through like you would do in some of the UV or the projection modes in Cinema. You just select your object, your UV. What I like to do is normally you go between these panels, but whatever view you want to project through, select that view and then use frontal. and it's then projecting through the front. But if you look at the space, you do have to select your polygons and then fit to UV canvas. And then you get all your surface detail. So that's just a really quick way of doing it. If that's, what you want to do, you don't have time to do any of these other ones, which don't take too much time. You can still do that very, very quickly, and you have a UV laid out object that you can export to render very easily. I wanted to show a couple of other navigational aspects to UV mapping as well. I think a cube would demonstrate it most clearly. Again, the default of the UV mapping on a cube is all the faces are on top of each other. So if I select this face and then deselect and then select this face, it looks like it's the same selection, but it's just the faces laid right on top of each other. If you look at some of the UV mapping modes, so I've got the object and the UV tag selected. If I use box, I get a result like this. Now we see that when I select a face, these are all individual in space. So they're all kind of moved off of each other. When you're dealing with UVs, you have a lot of options. You can take that and using Control T to get into the transform mode inside this window. So when you use Control T, as long as you're inside this texture window, you'll be able to use this tool. You'll see this selector show up with these arrows that limit it vertically or horizontally. And you can take this UV and separate it. Because before, as you notice, there's no white line here, so it's considered kind of welded in one piece. But if you were to move it, then you've actually created a cut seam. If you want to do things like repair that, let's say you wanted to join an edge back here, you can UV weld and relax. And what that does is it joins it and it relaxes everything else relative to it. You do that here as well, UV and relax. Or you find this edge, if you wanted to bring it back to the way it was, UV weld and relax. Oh, what it's doing is it's moving the entire UV and rotating it because the orientation is not preserved at that point. So you get that result. So it's not like it was taking that cube and putting it down there. It's rotating the entire UV and giving you a new scenario. So if you wanted to bring it back, you could actually select that, Control T, which is already in that mode, bringing it close to vertical, and you can select not only just this one or just this one, the resulting alignment will be the same. So if I did that, or if I did this, the alignment's the same because this was closer to horizontal and this was closer to vertical. And then you would bring the UV packing window up and apply. So now you've got a nice UV layout. Everything's nice and straight. Even though I manipulated it, I tore it apart and then welded it back together, you still get a nice UV layout. One other thing I wanted to show, because it may come into play if you're UVing something from CAD. Oops, I still had Control T selected, so it doesn't allow you to use it on that window. Control T is a tool that you can use in this window, but not in this one. You get a loud beep. But now that I'm in this transform tool, I'll make this editable. And I'll move it. I wanted to show what happens when you use, let's say, cylindrical mapping on this object. before I do that, I want to make a duplicate to make sure that we have something that's the same. So this UV layout shows up like this. This UV layout is identical, and I wanted to show the differences. So if I used cylindrical on this, select that UV tag. This is the result you get, and it doesn't map correctly on this because all it's doing is creating the UV in a cylindrical, if you can imagine an invisible cylinder kind of enveloping this shape. When it's projecting, this plane is right on the edge. It's right on the edge, so there's no way for it to tell the UV where to sit, so you don't see the disk that would otherwise be the top. If you wanted to see the disk, you might do box, and now you see the top because it's projecting from this direction, this direction, this direction, and top and bottom. What I wanted to show was that if we undo that and we undo that, so now these both have the default mapping. If you change the axis and let's say rotate it, what I did just there was I changed it from local to global, or global to local axis. So the local axis you can change, and the global will always stay relative to the world. Once you change the local axis, you turn that enable change off, and if you were to attempt to do the, let's say the box in this case, now you get a different orientation in the projection because the box is distorted. It's actually not distorted, but it's put in an angle when it's trying to apply the projections. So if you import CAD data and you want to do a cylindrical projection on a cylindrical shape, just make sure that your local pivot is in the orientation of the cylindrical shape of your CAD data. That'll give you a more reliable result, because otherwise you'll get kind of angles like this. Just a little trick if that comes in handy at any point. And I believe that's pretty much it. I did want to make an addendum to what I was showing before, which was I was saying to select faces in order to fit to UV canvas, and you don't really need to do that. I do that because I want to make sure that I get everything selected, but you really don't need to do that. For instance, if you used shrink wrap, so this doesn't take up the UV space, I'm not going to select the polygon faces, but I can still fit to UV canvas. So I just wanted to say that I select faces just to make sure, because sometimes you can have selections that will fit UV to canvas. If you do have any faces selected, they'll fit to UV canvas independently of everything else. So I just default on the safe side. And that's pretty much it. I mean, using all of those techniques, you'll be able to map anything pretty quickly.